Okay, I'm just going to now tweet the link. All right, viewers. So for some perfunctory context here, this was a pre-planned session that Douglas Lain and I had intended on having. And it was going to be him dictating it, being sort of the, I guess, interviewer or facilitator. But given that the pre-scheduled time happened to coincide with the announcement of Joe Biden's vice presidential selection, I felt that you deserved at least an initial take on that. So we have entered into the Kamala Harris reign of terror that is now upon us, or has befallen us. So like I said, after we do a little bit of a discussion haphazardly on Kamala, I'll then turn it over to you. But my initial impression is that, so maybe I have part of my brain is in tune with just the political operative world, and I just fail to see a persuasive political logic behind the pick, just on a strategic level. To set aside the substance, which we could also get to. But, for one thing, Kamala Harris ran a presidential campaign in 2020 that received an enormous amount of hype that was boosted assiduously by the commentariat, by the Democratic Party-aligned intelligentsia, by pundits and operatives who supported Kamala Harris and touted her largely on the grounds that she represented who they most thought the Democratic Party should look like in the Trump era. Mm-hmm. And the campaign was a disaster. I mean, it flamed out in almost humiliating fashion relative to the resources she had, to the elite support she had, to the media favoritism that she enjoyed. And why was that? Well, one of the reasons was because she didn't register really, in particular with black voters. There was a lot of lazy opinionating, which posited that because of the hue of Kamala Harris's skin, she was automatically going to be assured sizable support among, say, Southern black voters in South Carolina or something, which of course is extremely reductive and almost condescending. And it turned out, as probably ought to have been anticipated, that she often registered more support among white liberals than she did among black voters. In fact, in her infamous confrontation with Biden in that first debate, where she essentially ambushed him and said, "I'm not calling you a racist, but," focus groups subsequently conducted to that event found that black voters reacted poorly to it and white liberals reacted positively. And so if the idea is that now they're going to, that if one facet of the political logic which motivated this choice was that she's automatically going to boost turnout among black voters, I don't know. I almost feel as though Joe Biden is more of a turnout generator among black voters than she is. I mean, look at the results of the primaries and look at the close association Biden has with the first black president. I mean, it almost seems too obvious to even say at this point. And so who are the demographics that she galvanizes here? It's hard to say. I feel as though this is the product of interest groups and elite pressure exerted upon Biden to mold his quote-unquote ticket in such a way that accords with their rather insular sensibilities.
I before I got on the stream,
ahead.
I was reading a quote from James Clyburn, who had said after he got South Carolina for Biden that Biden should pick a black woman to be his VP, because the black women in America were owed something for their loyalty. And I thought about that a little bit, and I thought, well, wouldn't actual black women voters, be owed good representation, policies that would help them and meet their needs and overcome the problems in the black community? Isn't that how you would pay back voter loyalty, rather than picking one person to represent some sort of gift to the black electorate? I think the people who were owed something might be the political operatives who happen to be black in the Democratic Party, more than and either happen to be black or happen to be of a certain ideology in the Democratic Party. So that Clyburn was saying, look, this is what we did for you. This is what you have to do for us. I don't really know exactly how the politics around Clyburn works, or what goes on in the Democratic Party to jockey the black vote, or to herd the black vote. But Clyburn seemed to have some power in that arena. So this would seem to me to be kind of elite politics that wouldn't have much of an impact overall, in the actual outcome, but it's more inter-party stuff.
Yeah, I think that's roughly accurate. And you're right to say that this is indicative of an elite campaign, or to suggest that, because black voters consistently demonstrated that they weren't voting, or they weren't kind of crafting their candidate preference on the basis of shared racial identity. They just weren't, or otherwise they wouldn't have voted for Joe Biden by such enormous numbers. I mean, the punditocracy assumed that that's how they would vote, but they didn't.
Yeah, and black voters are slow to embrace Barack Obama. In 2008,
kind of. I mean, that I looked pretty closely at the polling data from 2008, earlier on in this cycle, just because something about that narrative didn't seem quite right to me. So, I mean, this is neither here nor there in a way, but if you go and look at South Carolina polling in 2007, Obama does gradually establish a foothold there in the months preceding the primary. So it wasn't like overnight he wins an Iowa caucus, the late John Lewis endorses him, and then all of a sudden the black voters rush to support Obama. I mean, Obama he was cultivating support through visiting the black churches, through marshaling his faction of kind of the party's power structure behind him that maybe weren't so keen on the Clintons. And yeah, but it was split for a while. And then, but then there was a critical mass. But the other thing is, okay, let's say that in order to give some kind of gift to black women, you then need to select as vice president a black woman. Let's just accept the logic of that, which is obviously contestable. Why would it necessarily be Kamala Harris? I mean, Kamala Harris, it's sort of, people are going to get mad at me for saying this, but she's not a traditional, I don't even know how I should phrase this, but she's not she's not an African American in the way that Val Demings is.
She's
Karen Bass
child of immigrants, right? She's a child of a Jamaican immigrant and an Indian woman. She doesn't have a familial connection to the struggles that black Americans have gone through, for centuries now. So she's not. It's not like that doesn't make her.
She's not ADOS, is how people put it. African American descendant of slaves,
right?
But people say, oh, she has lineage from the Caribbean. Okay, the point is that if you're talking about the typical African American, she is of a different lineage. And if we're talking about if lineage and if race are such important factors here, then you think that would be worth taking into account if you accept the premise that Black women are owed a gift on account of their loyalty. And so I just don't think that this is going to be quite the motivator that certain other picks potentially could have been. I said from the outset that I thought Val Demings, this congresswoman from Florida, probably would be the much smarter pick politically, because she is an American descendant of slaves, for one. I mean, if we're getting in the arena of identity, I guess it does bear mentioning. And also, Kamala Harris she's a prosecutor from Berkeley who's married to a guy named Douglas Ermhorf, I think his name is. It's just like, it's not the most natural.
There's nothing wrong with the name Doug.
No, I'm sorry if that offended you. I retract that.
That's all right.
But just in terms of her kind of socio-political, how she's situated, it's not obvious that she is going to be this unambiguous motivator of Black votes that otherwise would not have gone to Biden in the way that I think other potential candidates might have. So that's why I think it's important to just to characterize this as something that party elites really wanted for whatever reason, rather than kind of framing this as somehow what Black women wanted, so you can make it appear more populist in orientation or something.
There's what comes to mind right now is something I've been reading about in the last week or so. I've been reading CLR James. The other day I had a conversation with Ralph Leonard, who's a big CLR James fan. And CLR James had this theory of the Black Vanguard in America. And he put that together, theorized that in the 50s and 60s. And the idea was that Black Americans, African Americans, had a particular perspective and politics born out of their struggles, and that their instincts were more radical than most workers in America. And he thought that that would be where the energy would be in the next decades or so, and that the struggle for the rights of African Americans would be the struggle for socialism. And the justification for that was that the African Americans still had yet to achieve basic bourgeois liberal rights. The right to vote, the right to go to a diner, free movement, all sorts of rights were denied Black Americans. So that was where political struggle went. But I think that when people consider someone's race as when they're thinking about politics or who they want to represent them, they might be thinking in a way that's similar to CLR James. Like, okay, this person being Black is more likely to have been through the struggles of Black Americans, is more likely to push for the kinds of changes, reforms, or radical changes that will help me and that will help the overall movement towards a freer, better society. I don't see Kamala Harris as coming out of that kind of experience, and I don't think you could use that kind of logic to justify it. But I think that is in the background of the way people talk about Kamala Harris.
And that logic just seems so non-operative now for a variety of reasons. And actually, the fact that if it's non-operative, if we grant that that's the wrong prism through which to view racial politics at this juncture, in a way, I think that would be a positive thing, because it means that you can't just make assumptions about anybody's political predilections on the basis of their skin color. Like, isn't that an ideal to be aspired toward? Isn't that sort of in line with what Martin Luther King envisioned? I know a lot of people feel like Martin Luther King's political philosophy is obsolete now, which is kind of amazing in its own right. But think of this. And people forget this, or maybe they never knew it. But in the 2012 Republican primaries and the 2016 Republican primaries, in both primary cycles, Black men at one point led the national polls. Okay, Herman Cain in 2012 recently died, and Ben Carson in 2012 did briefly lead national polls. He actually overtook Trump for a while in the fall of 2015. Okay, so I mean, what does that indicate? That indicates that if you're still tethered to the prism you just outlined there, it denies what is apparently the political experience of maybe not a massive, but a non-trivial portion of American blacks. And in a way, that I would think that should be welcome because, you probably want a society where your skin color doesn't automatically entail that you favor. You should be able to be a reactionary conservative and a black person in the United States.
Well, I know that is possible. I can name a few, right?
Yeah, you can name a few.
Right. But I don't know if I would call Thomas Sowell a reactionary, but certainly a conservative. The other thing to remember about the model that CLR James was putting forward was that it was not about picking out individual politicians in his mind. It was about what section of the working class was likely to take up a political struggle and to create a movement for political change. And at the time, he was right. I mean, the civil rights movement came after his writing. He was sort of seeing the future, and you don't really judge that kind of analysis based on what our ideal should be, but rather, what is the historical moment? What kind of factors are playing into the problems in society, and where is there going to be a progressive force for change? But I think today it's unclear as to whether or not Black Americans would be the most vanguard or progressive force in America. I think it's possible still. There's still a lot of disparity. There's still a lot to overcome. And I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement, for all of its faults, is just in terms of like trying to take on the problem of police brutality, it is leading that fight. Black people are leading that fight, and that's because they are feeling the problem more deeply. I think maybe 50 years ago, this idea that blacks as a group, so not picking out individuals, but blacks as a group in some sense are going to be more aware or in tune with the popular struggle that subjected many of their co-racialists to state-sanctioned subjection, and therefore that group-based that attribution of some kind of common political purpose on the basis of a racial group would at least make some sense. But 50 years later, I'm not sure it does. After many decades of conscious diversification on the part of elite institutions, universities, the corporate world, the military, entertainment, etc., and so that has diluted or diversified the political experience of blacks, and therefore you'd expect them that's not necessarily to be maybe as homogenous in their orientation as they would have been in the 60s. I'm sure they weren't. They were not homogenous in their orientation in the 60s either. However, 50 years on, I think it's even less tenable to assign that kind of group-based logic than to the extent that it was tenable then, even if there were some issues, it's far less tenable now, almost to the point of being incoherent. I mean, Kamala Harris was a law enforcement elite. I mean, that's how she. Sure, yeah.
That's how she started her political career.
Yeah. Right. But Kamala Harris wouldn't have been representing the vanguard of the proletariat, in CLR James's view, even in 1950 or 1949 or something like. If she was around, it's like that's not who. That there was even then there was stratification within the black population in America. He was talking about black workers. He wasn't just talking about any black people. But the other thing to remember also is just that that vision of a black vanguard was not about how to get votes for the Democratic Party either, right? It was about which group of people were more likely to take to the streets, make demands on the system, make radical moves for what might be called radical reforms, and expand the power of working people in America. and that might actually be a way for us to segue away from Kamala Harris into the riots.
Yeah. Let's segue. Let me give one more thought, and then we can
Okay.
segue. So I just read a book called "Locking Up Our Own" by James Foreman Jr., which won the National Book Award in 2018 for nonfiction, and it was essentially a history of the 70s through roughly the 90s of the black political elite, specifically in Washington D.C., but he kind of makes extrapolations for nationwide in terms of how integral they were in instituting harsh, punitive criminal justice policy in response to the drastic increase of crime in that era, and especially in relation to heroin and crack, etc. And Washington D.C. was at the time in the 70s, when they instituted home rule, maybe the only city that was majority black city that was governed by a majority of blacks, and yet, it was a black-led movement to, for example, nix a proposal to decriminalize marijuana in the 70s, because the idea was that the basic argument for why those black political actors opposed marijuana decriminalization then was they were saying it was a white-led effort to justify why the white-controlled police department wasn't interested in policing predominantly black neighborhoods as vigorously as they would predominantly white neighborhoods, or in other words, not hold perpetrators of crime accountable in predominantly black neighborhoods. And they're saying, "Oh, you're just going to try to legalize marijuana, and that gives you an excuse not to police our communities, because you don't care about keeping us safe." And so that's all to say, and it's an interesting book, especially now to read. Which is all to say that there is a current of African American political thought and life, which is very much congruous with a relatively harsh stance on, quote, law and order, on punitive measures in relation to crime control, etc. And Kamala Harris, a previous iteration of Kamala Harris, might have been a representation of that current of thought, but she's now in this sort of weird netherworld where she does the whole, her campaign was the most way too online campaign maybe ever, where her big policy proposal at one point was banning Trump from Twitter, where she was checking every quasi woke box you could think of and running away, and they viewed it as a liability that she was a prosecutor and she threw people in jail. So she couldn't embrace that in the context of a Democratic primary.
Maybe she can embrace it now.
Maybe she can embrace it now, but I feel like her identity has now become her political identity has become so fuzzed up, or it's become so muddled and incoherent that in terms of the political logic, it seems like she's not going to be able to mollify those who might like to see a Democratic vice presidential pick who's committed to law and order and has an oppositional view on the riot / protest, whatever. It doesn't seem like it satisfies that political impulse, and yet it does alienate the activist progressives who still haven't gotten over the whole Kamala as a cop image. So it's like you get the worst of both worlds in a way.
Yeah. Look, I don't know if the Democrats actually wanted to win at the beginning of this primary process, when they were started out for 2020, or what the Democratic strategy really was. And I think that everyone's in a position now where Trump looks like he's a loser. And that's not because of anything the Democrats have done. It's not because they're running a particularly smart campaign, but it's just because real life has intervened to make Trump seem like an unacceptable choice for a lot of people, most people. So, and I feel like the whole campaign's going to rise or fall for Biden based on whether or not we can hold off a economic catastrophe, whether or not Trump gets some credit for this new executive order, how bad the infection rate continues to be. Those are the things that are going to matter. And I don't think Harris is really going to matter at all.
I don't know. I mean, I think did you happen to see the first Kamala related attack ad that the Trump campaign just put out? It was within minutes of the announcement. I mean, I actually think that if there was ever a time for a vice presidential nominee to be an actual liability for a presidential nominee, this might be it, just because given Biden's advanced age, who knows if he's even going to be able to serve a full term, much less 2 terms. I mean, he's 78 years old. And basically what this ad was obviously created well in advance. And the message was, if you vote for Biden, you're getting Harris. Mm-hmm. She's going to be calling the shots. She's going to be the de facto president. And, I think there's a very good chance, given her poor performance in the primaries, given the fact that she's so elite, she's so elite. She's almost like a elite fabrication in a way, given how little electoral appeal she evidently has, or that she's demonstrated. I could very well see her repelling more voters than she attracts. And so, are there going to be are there going to be fundamental factors that kind of dictate the outcome of the election more so than the pick of Kamala Harris? Sure. I mean, there's a pandemic, there's a cratering economy, et cetera. But around the margins, if certain states are close, whatever. Who knows?
Well, who would you have picked?
I mean, if I was advising Biden and I didn't care at all about the substance, just from a purely political tactician standpoint, I would have told him to pick Val Demings, former police chief of Orlando. I mean, unless there's something crazy in her background that we're not aware of, I just felt that Val Demings is pretty polished. She was actually a impeachment manager for the Democrats during the whole impeachment fiasco that people have basically forgotten at this point. But she performed well. She performed well at that tech hearing recently with Zuckerberg and Tim Cook and CEO of Google and such. And I just felt like she straddled a certain line that maybe would mollify more law and order craving voters, but also check the requisite identity boxes. And also, she's in a ADOS. She just.
So you think it's important that Biden have picked a black woman?
Well, I mean, whether it's important or I think there's definitely a scenario in which picking a black woman could motivate additional turnout. I think, but it would have to be the right black woman. I mean, that's right. Okay. I mean, as should be obvious that you can't just throw any person with a particular skin color at voters and assume that they're going to act the same. So I mean, Val Demings struck me as a reasonably good. I thought Karen Bass would probably be similar, although being from Southern California, it's probably a little bit less electorally advantageous than Val Demings from Florida.
Why not Pete? Why not forget the black woman thing and pick Pete Buttigieg?
Well, I mean,
he did the best in the primaries. Really, he did better than for a while. He did better than Biden. He beat expectations for a while. I think.
I mean, I was going off the assumption that it would have to be a woman given Biden's injunction or self-imposed rule, whatever. But I mean, now I would have to kind of broaden my range of possible picks. I guess Pete may have made some sense, although I don't know that I would have recommended Pete. I mean, what's sort of so funny about this is, like, obviously Biden deep down almost certainly would have preferred somebody that he was like colleagues with in the Senate for 30 years or something, some old guy who's like maybe 5 years younger than him. Yeah. Like I was thinking about this earlier today, and the senator that floated to the top of my mind was Richard Lugar, who's deceased.
Well, that would have been perfect.
That would have been perfect. I mean, I feel like
if Biden and a dead guy. for off.
Yeah, if they could resurrect him. But like, let's say Dick Lugar was still alive, right?
Mm.
And maybe 15 years younger than he was when he died. He was sort of like an internationalist Republican. He actually had a good relation with Obama. He co-sponsored nuclear non-proliferation legislation with Obama. That's the type of guy that I think deep down Biden would be drawn to, if not for the exigencies of like the interest group politics within the Democratic Party. So, I mean, it would come down to, are you going based on political expediency in terms of helping you win the election, or do you just want a governing partner? I think from a governing standpoint, Kamala is a nightmare. I mean, she's going to be running for president from day one. And it's not that a vice president can't, quote, have ambition, but I mean, do you really want every day to be dominated by speculation about what your vice president's up to in terms of their electoral ambitions? It just seems like a total distraction. And it's just going to be disruptive in terms of the ability for a Biden to implement an agenda legislatively. And that's why, Karen Bass probably would have been helpful in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to take,
but yeah, we can transition. Yeah. So now we're going to go to the portion that was like the plan from the beginning.
The plan,
charge, and you can interrogate me or whatever.
I mean, it's not really an interrogation. I do want to start out by just noting. Well, I mean, look, I'm on the left, a Marxist and all that kind of thing, and I believe that quite a few people who follow my channel and are part of my audience may not be part of the Michael Tracy fan club. You'd
be surprised. I get a lot of private messages from self-described leftists and liberals who, thank me for what I do. I mean, to the extent that there's a fan club, it's a little bit more ideologically diverse than you might think.
Yeah, well, I just know that I was watching a video with Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and a few other people, and Matt Taibbi was like, I'm afraid to defend Michael Tracy in public. He said during the live stream. Not that he did defend you in that live stream, but he noted how much animosity there was for you online. So I wanted to start just by asking you, like, did you intend to cultivate quite as many detractors on Twitter as you have? And you said that your fan club's diverse. It seems to me that your haters are fairly diverse as well. So I'm just, how does that affect you?
Well, I mean, I didn't intentionally cultivate haters. I feel like it's just, I guess, perhaps a natural extension of my personality to generate haters. Mm-hmm. But the composition of the haters has shifted over time. There were times when my haters were right-wing Republicans predominantly. And even, when Trump does something that I object to, we can go a week or 2 weeks or something where I have an uproar from MAGA types. Like a big example somewhat recently was the Soleimani assassination, where they were calling for my crucifixion essentially as a result of my take on that. And also related to the pandemic. I mean, I have a constant deluge of MAGA types who are either outright virus denialists, or they think that it's largely a hoax. And
I've just seen you do things on Twitter where it seems to me that you're purposely provoking people, and you don't actually care who it is. Like, you were recently tweeting about how video games are a big waste of time, and anyone who wastes their time playing video games is a loser or something like that. And I just
I said that as somebody who was obsessed with video games as a child and adolescent, so I speak from experience.
Oh, I know. I don't take it like I don't care, but it just seemed like, does he have a checklist of people who are really online that he's trying to antagonize, or what's going on here?
Actually, the gamers are the most easily antagonizable.
I know.
Demographic. I mean, you say one, you question their hobby, even mildly. I mean, I guess I did it sort of abrasively, but they absolutely flip out, which is sort of amusing. I mean, it's okay. Stick to your Super Nintendo or something, guys. I mean, whatever. I think part of what it's based on, maybe I'm like psychoanalyzing myself here.
Yeah,
is that I don't know. I'm almost naturally inclined to probe what I view as tensions in popular discourse, or the meaning like logical tensions, or unexplored areas of incongruity within how things are framed. You had a lot of that in 2016 in relation to how Trump was depicted, which made the liberals really dislike me for a while. And you have a lot of that now in terms of the protests and the riots, I find. So is there like some kind of base level impulse in me that kind of drives me to get into those areas of online discussion where I'm potentially going to be rubbing people the wrong way or touching on a nerve? I guess so, but it's not like I consciously plot it out. It's just something that feels. It's just something that I'm in. It's just sort of like an intuition, I guess, that maybe is based on some genetic predisposition that I can blame on my parents.
Yeah. Well, okay. I am glad you're that self-aware that you're seeing that you do that. You do that. But that's actually.
But I think it's just. I mean, when I do it
As
I
a
feel
journalist,
like
it's not a bad. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
actually a bad instinct. It may not be. Twitter may not be the best forum for you ultimately, but it's not a bad instinct.
I'm a defender of Twitter. I mean, people can always like put on this world weary facade, like, oh, this website's terrible, blah blah blah. But a lot of I've gotten a lot of pretty good opportunities through Twitter. I have a reasonably robust following. It's enabled me to have it's in part enabled me to have a financial self-sustaining.
Yeah,
model.
no, I know.
So I don't like to denigrate it too flippantly.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like YouTube or anything else. On the one hand, or like the rest of the digital world, really. On the one hand, it's kind of destroying more traditional institutions that would provide a journalist like yourself a more secure footing, possibly. But on the other hand, it has made the space for journalism or all sorts of writing or content creation, as they say, is it's more varied now, and it's anyone's game almost. You can see a lot of people enter the space who may never have been there in a different time. But here's my question. I want to get to the rioting stuff. Your work after the riots in late May and early June. And I guess the first thing I'd say is that I think the reason I invited you onto the ZeroBooks channel, and this part of the conversation will probably end up there in an edited form, was because I think it's important for people on the left who are really interested in radical change to hear what you're saying about the riots.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Because even if your framing isn't always the same as the way I would frame things, or even if you sometimes sound like you're spouting right-wing talking points or something, nonetheless, that stuff should be taken up and considered, because there is obviously some truth to the idea that for everyday people, riots are something to hate, and they are disruptive, and they don't lead people to want to join any kind of progressive movement. If anything, they often will turn people to authoritarian figures or to a deeper love of the police. I mean, after the uprising, when this started in late May, the first thing I thought of was, if all you have are riots demanding that you throw the bums out, and all you have is a continued battle on the streets, you're going to end up with a military occupation. You don't end up with some progressive outcome. You can think of like the Arab Spring as a dramatic example of where that tactic leads. So I was glad that you went out and looked at the aftermath of what had happened in late May and early June.
And by the way, just to interject briefly, in terms of, it wasn't a military occupation, but the National Guard was widely deployed in the aftermath of the riots in late May, early June. And virtually everyone who I spoke to, predominantly Black, almost entirely non-white, actually, in Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, New York, Minneapolis, St. Paul, obviously, they all welcomed the presence of the National Guard. They didn't believe it to be some kind of odious infringement on their civil liberties. They viewed the National Guard as necessary to bring about the resumption of order and the diminishment of the threat that had been posed to them. So it did, in my experience, increase the affinity among a lot of populations to the military. Now, does that rise the level of military occupation? No, and the National Guard was withdrawn relatively quickly. But you get the idea. You see which way that could potentially go if it were to have escalated even further.
Yeah, if you don't have a political force to take charge, if you don't have a political project to change society, and you just disrupt and destroy what it already exists, you're going to end up with something like a military dictatorship or warlordism or something like that. So something will come in that's not pretty to fill in the void. But I wanted to ask you about what you thought the causes of the riots were, and whether or not you can, like, I'll quote you something, or I'll tell you what's on my little list of questions. I wanted to get your impression of this idea that a professor who teaches critical theory at UC Davis puts forward. He wrote a book for Verso called Riot, Strike, Riot. And in that book, he suggested that the riot is a form of class struggle, just like the strike, but that it's a spontaneous form that rises up when there's an economic crisis. And it's a struggle that's taking place in the realm of circulation rather than in the workplace or the realm of production, to put it in Marx talk. And that when you see riots like this happen, especially huge riots that spread across the whole country, that you can see that as a symptom of capitalist crisis. Would you agree with that sentiment?
So the riots and the protests writ large are extremely multifaceted.
Yeah, I'm talking about late May, early June.
No. Yeah. So it's a little difficult to make any easy extrapolations that are going to be all encompassing, right? But at least my impression is that the riots, or many of the most inflammatory riots, in particular Minneapolis, St. Paul, which kind of sparked the entire thing, were in a way ideological riots.
Even there,
even there, yes. In a way, ideological riots. So if there's like an overt ideological motive behind the instigation of the riots, then I think I wouldn't necessarily conflate that with the type of riots you would expect to see if the motive was pure economic desperation, right? If you're economically desperate and you're there and you're rioting, that's different from being like an insurrectionary anarchist and having a motive where your explicit intention is to bring about kind of a national uprising in line with your political objectives, right? So that's why I don't know if you read the Medium post that I did a few weeks ago, where I kind of did a summary of a lot of the trip that I took. So I just got home on late.
I think I did, but I may have forgotten what was in there. Did you find that the very first riots were, because my impression was that it was kind of a multi-ethnic working class riots, that there were riots and there was looting, that they were hard to differentiate from each other, and that you may have seen some, sentiments put on, spray painted on like I guess it was a target that said some like a quote from Marx was on the target, but that overall it was a spontaneous kind of reaction to the deprivation and frustration. And it was frustration with the state. So you would have some expression of dissatisfaction. But do you think this was planned in some way, or that there were like maybe some sorts of political organizations, radical political organizations that were ready?
I do think there's a network, and I don't want to be too I don't want to spout off right-wing talking points here, but I do think that there are organized networks of radical insurrectionaries who were waiting for a moment that was the spark that could create a vacuum that they could then insinuate themselves into. And if you watch that first live stream on the night where the 3rd Police Precinct building in Minneapolis was essentially besieged, and the police fled, which was remarkable, and then the police precinct was burned, and that really precipitated the major, severe, historic riots that we saw that first week or so in late May, early June. It was clear that there were overtly left-wing activists who had come to Minneapolis to do this. I mean, they weren't bashful about it. They were being interviewed on camera. They were explaining their reasons for being there. And then, so that's why in this Medium post, I tried to
This was a week after the initial.
No, this was so George Floyd was killed on the 25th of May, and then the police. He was burned down 3 or 4 days later. So whatever that the police precinct building was initially kind of infiltrated. So I want to say May is March, maybe it was May 29th, something like that. And so that's why in that Medium post I tried to differentiate between the different elements of the riots. Obviously, it's hard to say with exact precision. But, my impression in talking to people who participated in the riots, who experienced the riots in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in particular, and it carries over to other places. But, Minneapolis, St. Paul is obviously the epicenter. I think there was a concerted effort by relatively organized radicals to foment insurrectionary activity. By doing things like committing arson attacks. So when you commit arson attacks, that's going to consume municipal resources, right? Because you have to have the fire and police trying to ameliorate those incidents. And they were extremely widespread around Minneapolis, St. Paul. I mean, you walk around certain areas and it's stunning how certain blocks have been reduced virtually to rubble. And then, so once there's that vacuum in place, then you have what I would maybe call the more working class. I'm sure some of these insurrectionary anarchists are like working class in a sense, but they have a more explicit ideological motive than the broad-based working class, I would say.
Sure. They're the vanguard, Michael.
Yeah, okay, they're the vanguard. Exactly. It's funny. I'm now doing 2 streams in a row on consecutive days where I'm using the Marxist terminology here, which people might find amusing.
Did you talk to Ben Burgess? Is that who you're thinking of? You did before?
Ben Burgess I did last week, and yesterday I did Vosh.
Oh yeah, Vosh,
the YouTuber, which was interesting. Anyway, so we were we spent like 20 minutes on what bourgeoisie means. Anyway.
I'll have to go watch that. I want to know what it means.
Okay, yeah. I should have called you up as my phone a friend lifeline.
Yeah. I would have been able to tell you.
In memory of Regis Philbin, who just died, or something. Anyway, so in Minneapolis, St. Paul, once those municipal resources are consumed, and they were really consumed. There was a guy who lives near Lake Street, which was the ground zero of the riots where the police precinct building is, who told me, look, we were told that first weekend that we were on our own in terms of the police and fire. They had to fill up barrels of water to have on hand in case one of the flaming embers that were coming from the buildings that were on fire, because there was high winds one night, happened to land on their house, because there was no fire department available to them to be called. So municipal resources truly were consumed. And so in that context, you have things like in the more heavily black areas, say North Minneapolis, where a bunch of kids running around, where there's no police, where they're amped up anyway, and all their friends are doing it, can just rush into like a Foot Locker, take all the shoes that they want. So I mean, I think it is important to distinguish that kind of looting, which takes place in the context of a riot, from the insurrectionary activity, which maybe instigated the more dramatic.
Yeah, that distracted the cops. The cop went over there. They couldn't do the foot. Yeah. No,
and you saw that in Chicago to a large extent as well. Where, I mean, one thing that's amazing to me is that you could just go drive through the West. I don't know if this is exactly the case now, although there was just more rioting recently in Chicago. But when I was there in mid to late June, drive through the South Side, Chicago, and the West Side, almost entirely black areas. And it's astonishing the number of places, one after another, that were boarded up. And that's because there was no police presence for a while. I was talking to you can go find the interview on my YouTube channel, but there was an older black guy in the West Side who was telling me that, like, at one point the police were ready to clamp down on the rioters on the West Side, which again, mostly black kind of teenagers and 20s, who were going from like apparel store to Foot Locker to shoe store generally. They were ready to clamp down on them, and then they just kind of retreated. They were utterly overwhelmed. That's why the National Guard had to be called in. Yeah, right? Yeah. Although they only went to the downtown area, the National Guard actually didn't protect, in some cases like Chicago, the heavily black areas. And you know, so in terms of the UC Davis professor, I think that interpretation might have some validity with regard to the looting. But in terms of the more ideological rioting, I'm not sure that it necessarily applies. Well, they all kind of converged into the same series of events. So it's, again, a little bit hard to distinguish, but it is necessary if you want to understand the full nature of what transpired.
You know, look, I think that I don't know this for a fact, but the UC Davis professor is, I know this for a fact. He's some sort of theorist that is like an autonomous Marxist or anarchist himself. Okay. So I would imagine what he would say is, well, yeah, when the working class isn't without its ideas, and when they are rioting, they're trying to attack what they see as their oppressor or the system that they're trying to change or overcome, just in the same way that workers will go on strike consciously and ideologically and, you know, for reasons. So he really might say, yeah, the people who are throwing Molotov cocktails at the Justice building here in Portland, or the cops, the police stations, are reacting to the economic crisis. Theoretically, they're doing it with some planning and some thought. So it doesn't mean that it isn't coming out of the economic crisis to say that it was ideological. Those two things aren't quite mutually exclusive. But the other thing I'll say is, if it's true that this is a whole bunch of anarchists doing it, then the anarchist scene has massively expanded since the 90s.
I know. I mean, I think, in a way, I don't know if you read the piece that I did on Portland, where I also was for Unheard last week.
Yeah, I did read that recently. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I started out by saying, look, you got to give the anarchists some credit here. I mean, they've really expanded their influence on American politics. And I think a lot of it has to do with because they ended up situating themselves against Trump, right? For the first time Trump used the word Antifa, it was sort of like a milestone, because it just means that a huge amount of more people are going to be exposed to the concept of anarchism, right? Whereas it would have been a little bit more fringe previously. And their tactics have been successful. I mean, I quipped this. I made this sort of quip to somebody recently, but I think it probably is true that this is the most successful sort of anarchist tactical move, maybe since they assassinated William McKinley. I mean, I don't know exactly, but I mean, their ideas have gotten a huge amount of exposure recently.
Yeah, even more than in '99.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that was an isolated event. I mean, this is now virtually nationwide.
Yeah, well,
and you also have a situation where Democrats who don't really know the ins and outs of Antifa or radical networks, or
don't they though, Michael? Don't they?
Oh, sorry. I mean, yeah, they're probably all on like a Zoom call with George Soros as we speak.
Right.
But like, your average, to be serious, the average Democrat in Congress or something doesn't have a whole lot of familiarity with how radical networks work or what their ideological backgrounds are. So they're in a situation where, because the Antifa, like in Portland, for example, are just positioned against Trump, then they sort of elicit the support from normie Dems who are just saying, "Oh, they're just peaceful protesters," and it's just like, okay. I mean, I was in Portland for a week. I guess you're there as well, but like, it's not.
I didn't go down to the protest.
You didn't go down, okay, but like, it's not. What happens in Portland from like 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. is not a classically peaceful protest. It's not like a sit-in or something.
But it's a classically Portland protest, though.
Right, but
I'll say that.
Sure, but it's insurrectionary activity. It just is.
But we've had, I mean, look, in 2003, we had a lot of Antifa participation in the peace movement, the movement against the invasion of Iraq, and which I was a part of and I was organizing. And I knew a lot of anarchists. And in fact, at the time, I considered myself to be an anarchist. Because if you're an anti-capitalist and you weren't a Marxist and you're an American, you're an anarchist, like maybe depending on what kind, but I moved here in 91. I used to subscribe to, or at least often enough pick up Anarchy magazine, which existed.
How about was Adbusters?
Oh yeah, Adbusters, true too. Yeah, absolutely. I was an Adbusters anarchist in the 90s. That's what I was. So, but I wasn't the kind that was. I was an armchair anarchist. I was not the guy in the Antifa costumes, but I knew those people around I was, by the time that the war started, I was too old to be really a cool anarchist. But I knew those people, and they did things.
Up there, like 30 or something.
Yeah, I was 30 actually.
Oh, okay.
I was actually 30.
Just missed it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, but anyway, I knew these people. And by the way, back in this will bring me to your experience in Portland. At the time in 2003, 2004, there were the anarchists insisted that Portland Peaceful Response Coalition accept a diversity of tactics.
Right.
And the coalition itself ran the range anywhere from actually right-wing libertarian to these anarchists. There were some Marxists there as well, trying to sell newspapers. But that was the full spectrum of the ideology there. And, the basically democratic center of the peace movement, in other words, the people who were, somewhere involved with an NGO in their time, they had some experience within the Democratic Party or adjacent organizations, accepted the diversity of tactics, then regretted it later. And one of the things that came out of that was that when journalists would show up to our protests, as it got closer to the actual day of invasion, some people who were part of the anarchist group would confront them, threaten them, push them around, because the corporate media was the enemy. They were going to misrepresent us. They were going to create propaganda for war. They had blood on their hands, et cetera, et cetera. I was one of the people saying that was, misguided at the very least to do that. That we wanted to ensure that we would lose support. This was a great way to do it. But yeah, I mean, this is not something brand new. So I wanted to ask you about having set that up. What was your feeling about being confronted for filming in Portland, and how did it make you feel about the anarchist movement?
Well, I was actually, maybe this was naive, and I mentioned this in sort of the post-game stream that I did afterwards. Maybe I was naive, but I felt that the filming was so ubiquitous at this Portland protest that every two steps you took, there was some guy with his phone out streaming, that I wouldn't raise any suspicion by doing the same. It was a little bit surprising to me, but I guess the problem in their mind was that at one point I was walking around sort of near this fencing area where you have the federal courthouse, where a lot of the more, I guess you could say, extreme agitation was occurring. And I just happened to have a frame where there were several definitely anarchists arriving for the night with their full garb on, their shield with the Anarchist A emblazoned on the shield, who didn't want to be filmed at all, even though they had their masks. I mean, I don't even know how they could be identified, really. And, the expectation there is you're just going to comply with their demands. So they ordered me to stop filming. I don't know if you saw the video. I guess you saw the video.
Yeah. Well, I didn't watch the whole video. I saw some of it. I get queasy watching that kind of stuff. I'm so against that kind of response to people like yourself. I find it so irritating that I didn't watch it. This happened the day after you tried to ask the mayor about COVID and were told that you were being racist for bringing the issue up.
Yeah. The first night I arrived happened to be the same night that Ted Wheeler finally made an appearance at the protest, the mayor of Portland. And because I had come from Seattle and on the drive there, I had listened to a press conference with Kate Brown, the governor, who was talking about how COVID cases had been going up in Portland, and she was instituting new measures to, accommodate that when what have you. And it was just, this is sort of an angle that I've been on for a while now, but it does strike me as notable that virtually all of these gatherings have blatantly contravened the measures that have been put in place around the pandemic. And it also seems to me that if you're talking about what the working class wants, and you can't really totally generalize, but they want their job not to be a pandemic anymore.
Yeah,
that's killing their friends and relatives in huge numbers.
Yeah,
and harming them and causing their jobs to be shuttered and such.
And if that's not the case, they'd like safe working conditions.
Sure.
And they'd like unemployment benefits to remain.
Yeah, and like the historically large mass gatherings, it's just not consistent with that objective. It's just not. I'm sorry.
Right.
You can get into like a fine-grained data debate, which I sort of did yesterday with Vosh in terms of the extent to which
that the protests didn't cause any
spread. Exactly. So the largest protest movement in the U.S. history, at least according to the New York Times, had no effect whatsoever on virus spread, even though there's a perfect correlation in many places when you saw the summer spike after the protest. But let's set that aside.
Can I just say one thing about that? I think the truth about that is we are not in a position to really know what the full effect of the protests were in terms of the spread. We don't have we don't have contact tracing set up.
Exactly.
The
infrastructure is a joke in the first place. So like if you can't say one way or another with total certainty.
Right. But it's clearly the case that there was a spike after. Some part of that has to have something to do, maybe not as much as might have been expected, but something to do with it in certain locations for sure. And overall, it's probably not a great idea if you're concerned or at high risk from COVID to go to one of these mass protests. So
exactly. I mean, otherwise, why don't we just return to the state of life where mass gatherings are permitted and encouraged, like music festivals and such? I mean, I feel like people
just wear a mask, do it outside, it should be fine, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's essentially the logic of what people who disclaim any role of the protest in the virus spread. That's sort of the logical conclusion of what they're saying for the most part. So I wanted to ask Ted Wheeler just about that discrepancy. That goes back to the point of like when I have this intuition, to kind of probe potential tensions in popular discourse. I do that with politicians as well.
Well, that's when you're really doing your job well, I think. Right?
Okay, good.
Forget about the gamers. Hit these politicians.
Yeah, forget about the game. Well, the gamers got like one or two tweets, so it wasn't a huge amount of time spent from me. Ted Wheeler was pretty honest, I thought, about it. He said, what matters now is the Black Lives Matter movement. So he was saying that the movement supersedes concern with COVID, which at least is sort of an honest rendering of the position.
Right. I think he may have been now like, while I'm here at this protest.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
maybe tomorrow something else will matter.
Sure. I mean, he couldn't have, if he had said anything but that, he would have probably literally run out of the protest.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe it wasn't the most neutral setting to pose that question to him in. But, in that, when I asked him that question, and this was Ted Wheeler going around, it was sort of like, I think he termed it a listening session or something, where he was just going around and allowing any member of the public to come up and ask him questions. And so I asked him a question, and then what happened was, you can watch the video, there was a group encircled me, denouncing me for asking a question that had anything to do with the pandemic. And because in doing so, I was erasing Black voices, silencing people, demonstrating my racism and white supremacy. And you know, some of this rhetoric, it can be easy for people who don't attend these protests or aren't immersed in the activist factions who propel them to dismiss. You know, if you're just sort of on Twitter and there you have a little bit of a skeptical posture toward like woke style and that kind of thing, it can be, you can miss the fervency with which many of these people honestly believe what they're saying. Because there were people who were upset. They were truly upset. They were demanding my expulsion. You know, and they're almost entirely white, of course. There were one or two. I mean, the reason why
what I heard was
confrontation. There was one black
young
woman,
who you shouted at.
I didn't shout at her. She shouted at me.
Right, and you kind of shouted back a little bit.
I did shout. I shouted back a little bit. I was like, you know,
and that was like at that point, I feared for your life.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, it was really frustrating because I thought everyone was, including you, was not handling it perfectly, and you were probably handling it better than they were, but it was such a fraught, frustrating moment. I mean, I could tell there was no easy way to get through this thing. Like it was not a moment where you could say, okay, step back, let me just ask you a few questions, maybe we're on the same page, we don't know it, what are we assuming here? No, none of that was gonna.
No, because you know, they're of the mindset where they're confronting me, right? And they're demanding that I do things. They're not trying to initiate a reasoned discussion,
right?
And yeah, I mean, when you say I didn't handle it well, I don't know. If I'm just, even if it's not in a journalistic context, if I'm just like shouted at in that kind of way, then
I'm not saying there was a way to handle it perfectly, but. Do you remember the Halloween costume scandal that I think was at Yale, and there was a dean, and he was surrounded by people.
Erica Christoxis, I think is
and he stood there for like 3 hours or some long, maybe not 3 hours, but he stood there for a long while trying to talk to them. It was like a saint, and he had so much patience, and it didn't work. It didn't work, but he handled it well. You know, you shouted back, you know, within the first 30 seconds. You didn't, he went an almost, 30 minutes or something without shouting back. So that's all. I'm like, if you're running for Gandhi's position, you fail.
I admit that I don't fulfill the ideals of Gandhi all the time. But no, I think, having maybe to the extent that I'm willing to engage in a confrontation like that in a way that's not totally deferential to them, it is illuminating in the sense that it brings forth some of their sentiments in a way that you might not get in other contexts. So I didn't go into it saying, okay, I want to have a confrontation here. No, I mean, there are many other interviews that I had that were totally non-confrontational. I mean, this was, I think, the only one that was like that at all. But when in that kind of setting, you do maybe see viewpoints expressed that might not otherwise be observable. So in that sense, it is sort of, again, illuminating.
Well, do you think there's a correlation between the amount of real fear and about the future that people have and the possible deprivation or precariousness of their situation and the militancy that you encounter? Do you think that like, for instance, these kids are looking forward to, jobless future, and have, are already not sure how they're going to pay their rent, and or maybe because I know a number of people were involved in the protests through my kids, and because they've been involved in Eugene, and they're service sector workers who don't have the service sector to go back to, and who are getting degrees maybe, but for jobs that are in that may not exist. So they're they're facing the prospects that kind of was one of the reasons that Bernie Sanders existed as a phenomenon, is because he represented the interests of the young people. Do you think that that's informing this, even if it's expressing itself in a weird way?
It might be informing it to some extent. I mean, how could it not be, given the totally unprecedented circumstances that we find ourselves in right now, pandemic-wise, and with the economic contraction. But if that were such an animating impulse here, you would expect to see it expressed through an economic message of some kind, right? But this is part of the reason why they were so riled up at me was just I changed the subject. I mean, I feel as though if you brought up any kind of broad-based economic reform, right, it would have been shouted down as inconsistent with the message being propounded, because they were so zealous in ensuring that only Black voices were centered, and that it be an explicitly race-based appeal. There's got to be something. I mean, if you're telling me the service workers
I think
are involved in Eugene, I believe you.
The abolish the police is in its core an economic critique, because the only way you can abolish the police is to abolish the overall system, the nation state, the capitalism itself. So saying abolish the police, most of the people who say that are in some way or another starting to at least embrace an anarchist critique, which I don't, I'm not on board with now. I have a different approach to understanding capitalism, but I do think that there's an economic component to the most radical side of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the other thing I would say is I don't think it's fair to say that it is particularly, in Portland, obviously, and in Eugene, obviously, it's largely white, but so are the cities. But I would say that the leadership of even the radical side of the movement is diverse and largely Black. Because it's just in at the nightly protest. I don't know what the exact situation is now, but when I was there, with the exception of one night where they permitted Ted Wheeler to speak briefly, it's always Black speakers, and that's a conscious sort of tactical / philosophical decision on the part of the protesters to be centering or elevating or amplifying Black voices. Right. But doesn't necessarily mean that's not meaning that the organizers per se. No, but they are. The radical groups are led by something called BIPOC. So it is the radical contingent is led by people of color and largely Black people, and I would say that means that there are young Black people who are embracing anarchism.
Maybe that's true. That's probably true to some extent, just given the new notoriety around anarchism. You'd expect it to draw in some element of activist inclined, not Blacks and other non-whites. I don't doubt that necessarily. But I mean, it is sort of still striking where I was in Chicago, right, on Juneteenth, and there was a march one day, and I'm not exaggerating when I say, you can go look at the footage. I tweeted it at the time that the protesters or the marchers were less diverse racially than the police force, which had been dispatched to monitor them. So, I mean, come on, that is a little bit of if we're in this domain where we're so fixated on racial representation and skin color being so enormously significant, then that is kind of striking.
No, I mean, that in the
middle of Chicago on Juneteenth, We have like
Yeah.
a 95% white leftist march. I mean, and the police are largely non-white. I mean, it seems like a contradiction or a tension that just doesn't get explored. Because if you note it as I do, you automatically provoke, I guess, this very angry reaction. And I think that the reaction is so angry stems from the fact that people recognize it as something of a contradiction, but they don't want to grapple with the implications.
Right. No, I totally get where you're coming from. And I'm not even sure that the way that the organizing is being done, where, it has to be black people or people of color who are part of the organizing team, makes a lot of sense either, because we're not talking about salaried positions. We're talking about voluntary positions. So what you're doing is saying all the work and time is going to be, the responsibility of the few black people in your movement there, and that makes them leaders. They'll decide, right, where the next protest is going to be, and they'll decide how the work's going to be done to do it, and they'll do probably most of the work, because the organizers and leadership is the ones in these amateur or activist organizations. The organizers and the people who do the work and the leadership are all the same. They're the same people.
Well, I mean, you say it's non-salaried work, but that's probably the case in like Portland, right? But Black Lives, a lot of there is going to be salaried work. There probably already is.
Yeah, but
through the nonprofit sectors that are under the aegis of Black Lives Matter, which received a massive amount of donations.
Sure. But that's not the radicals.
No,
that's not the anarchists. That's the Democratic Party.
The right wingers would. I mean, again, I don't want to just repeat right wing talking points, but if you listen to what the founders of the actual Black Lives Matter organization say, and again, Black Lives Matter is now so diffuse that it almost doesn't matter what they specifically say. But like the actual organization, the people who coined the term, right, and founded an organization. I mean, there is one woman who says that she's a trained Marxist, and right wingers kind of make a big deal out of that and try to use it as a pejorative. But still, I mean, if true, there is sort of a radical element there, at least
that
was ordinary U.S. politics.
That was 2014.
Yeah.
That we're talking about. So yeah, today the new Black Lives Matter that are in the streets are actually, like, from what, again, this is all coming out of information that I have from Portland and Eugene, but my understanding is that there's like two contingents. And this is back to Joshua Clover's sort of theoretical position on this, is that when these things happen, what happens is there's a protest movement and a rioting movement, or a radical movement that riots, and and that the protest movement and rioters kind of both support one another, or mutual, because you can't really have the rioting movement without the protesters out there.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's also a struggle going on whether or not all the masses are going to go towards the radical side or be sent back into the Democratic Party.
I'm sure that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can tell you, like, from experience, like from secondhand experience, that you have people from the NAACP and the Democratic Party, through campus organizations coming down with some money in their pocket to organize peaceful protests that end up really emphasizing defunding the police and actually campaigning for Biden at the same time. And then because one of the most fascinating things about this to me early on, and was that you had protests even in the most nondescript, like, suburban towns in that first week or so, or maybe a little bit more, like through the first, like, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And so there was one night where I went to Bloomfield, New Jersey, because I happened to live somewhat nearby, where there was a protest. It's like a protest in Bloomfield, New Jersey. What? It's so much it made no sense if you know anything about this place. And there was a march that was it was organized by a black guy. But the attendees were like 95% white, and they marched to the police station, and it was peaceful. The police actually participated. Yeah, they almost sanctioned it. So in a way, you have this weird phenomenon where they're almost like state-sanctioned protests, which is why the term protest almost occurs to me as a misnomer. But the that's not new either, right? I mean,
no, it's not. But I was just going to say, just to finish the point, that the mayor ended up coming, and he said, look, we got to vote out Trump, and like he's like trying to channel the sentiments of the protest and saying, look, we got to basically vote for Joe Biden in November.
Right.
So like there are times where it's explicitly a pro-Biden movement, and in fact, in Portland at one time, the one of the black leaders said like, look, we got to get rid of Trump, and he didn't couch it as a pro-Biden statement, but how could it not be anything but that? I mean, in a way, it's more effective if you don't couch it as a pro-Biden statement. Right. But yeah, you do see quite a bit of that because they accept the premise of Trump being a fascist menace who needs to be against whom of a diversity of tactics is warranted, and that is one factor in why the protest, I think, gained so much steam so rapidly. I doubt, in a way, that you would have seen that if you had anybody. If you had a Democrat in office, or even if you had a more "quote unquote" conventional Republican.
It's hard to say. I mean, probably you're right, but then again, Occupy happened under Obama, so it's hard to say. But I definitely think that it's the case that but
Occupy didn't really garner mainstream liberal support in the way that this did.
No, it did, but it did garner the support from the kinds of people who would end up in the Sanders campaign later. Yeah. It got like the people who I knew who had been organizing for Dennis Kucinich were supporters of Occupy, and who were the people who I thought needed to be driven out at the time because we were a radical revolutionary movement and not some Democratic Party surrogates.
Man, if you have to drive out Dennis Kucinich people, then you're really in a
I know
radical space. Let's say,
I was in my radical safe space. But I mean, seriously though, the fear was that the energy of Occupy would be funneled into the Democratic Party because it wasn't that he was at that time, organizing for Dennis Kucinich, but campaigning for Obama, within Occupy. So like there was a protest during Obama's presidency that then turned into a campaign for Obama within the Occupy. So it happens all the time.
It's sort of inevitable. I mean,
right.
There's always going to be an attempt to channel political fervor into an electoral way that is advantageous. I mean, there's nothing surprising about that necessarily.
But I also think that the protests in Portland were given a second life when Trump sent the Department of Homeland Security or federal police in to the city, that it became a bigger. I guess you showed up after.
I showed up after that had happened, but that's my understanding. Yeah, I mean, I think on the night that I happened to show up when Wheeler was there was the biggest night that had the most attendees up until that point. And then the following, I believe, Saturday was the biggest ever. So yeah, I mean, it definitely gave new life to it because I think it attracted normie Dems. I mean, it expanded the base beyond the insurrectionary anarchists, right? So one sort of amusing sight that I can vividly recall, and I actually took a photo of it at the time, was that, at like 10:30 or something on that Saturday night, you had an older couple, probably from a suburb of Portland. I should have spoken to them. I didn't get a chance. Who were like there amongst the radicals. They had to be in their 60s, and they had these these resistance rainbow flag T-shirts, which are obviously they got from some kind of like mainline Democratic website or something. And it's like they would never probably be at a protest like that if not for the way in which it came to be seen as like the vanguard against Trump, right? Because he actually had his agents there or whatnot. I mean, they would expose them, potentially risk getting tear gassed and that kind of thing if Trump wasn't a variable.
Yeah,
right.
Well, so I have an aunt who, or actually it's my wife's aunt, who was a big Hillary Clinton supporter, and I knew that the protests were going to have a lot of juice when she was like talking about how badly she felt for the people getting tear gassed and downtown.
There you go. Like if they were positioned against Obama, like you wouldn't if this had been 5 years ago or something, and it wouldn't have had the same purchase. I think amongst the sort of mainline normal, even they got a ton of media support, and that's sort of what annoys me. Where you have this constant refrain and mantra of, "Oh, they're just peaceful protesters." okay, most of the people who attend are going to be behaving peaceably. But when you have like fires and things like and full armor and communication systems and commercial grade fireworks and stuff, it's just not your standard peaceful protest. I wish people would be a little more honest about it. Where, I mean, if you want to proffer a case for why it's justified, okay, but don't be in this obfuscatory mode where you're not being honest about what's actually occurring. And you know, my encounter with the actual anarchist, one of whom snatched my phone right out of my hands and threatened to stomp me the fuck out. And
that means like
curb
stomp you, like that was
curb stomped. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like kill me essentially.
Yeah.
Like that's not peaceable behavior, let's say. So like, I mean, again, it's one thing to support that. Okay, make an argument, but don't be dishonest about how you portray things.
Yeah. Well, here's I think the strategy. You said something at the end of your piece in Unheard that I want to bring up here, and you said that you thought that the white radicals who are hijacking Black Lives Matter have every incentive to keep rioting.
Well, just to be clear, I didn't use the word hijacking. That was the headline from the editors.
Okay,
but yeah.
Right. Okay. But I understand. Yeah. Okay. So the white radicals who were riding alongside Black Lives Matter, let's say, have every incentive to keep the riots going because it's paying off.
Yeah. I mean, it's strategically bearing fruit.
Yeah. But I mean, okay. So then we have to ask, like, what is then the point of the violence, the fires, and I mean, it I think has to be thought of as aimed at provoking the police response, just as much as the police were, I think, intentionally there to, you know, give a second life to the protesters and stoke the flames of resistance. That Trump knew that was going to happen, and he did, and he encouraged them intentionally. The rioters are there to get the police response.
Yeah, but I mean, it is the case. I mean, I do think it's plausible that if there were no federal forces at the Mark O. Hatfield Federal Courthouse, it would have been taken or besieged. So, I mean, was there some kind of political motive there in terms of why Trump deployed the certain tactical units? Possibly. But, you know, I mean, if you're in this...
Do you think that the local cops wouldn't have been able to stop that?
I mean, I think they were given directives where they were not, quote unquote, protecting the courthouse any longer. That was part of the reason why. Okay. That's part of the reason why, if you listen to Chad Wolf, the Department of Homeland Security interim director, and you can believe him or not, but his stated rationale was that the Portland Police Bureau had made a decision not to guard the courthouse because of, you know, what the city council was saying, what the mayor was saying. I mean, they were saying that it's not their jurisdiction or whatever, which is different than how it works everywhere else in the country. So there's something unique to Portland there. But like, I mean, if let's say there was nobody guarding that courthouse on a particularly rancorous evening, I mean,
well, sure, yeah,
I'm pretty sure it would have been taken in a similar way as happened in Minneapolis with the 3rd Police Precinct building, right? So I mean, at the same time, could there be some political motive for Trump to wanting to be stoking some kind of confrontation? Possibly. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that. I mean, I remember this back in Occupy. It took off in New York City. And I was there from the very beginning. I was there almost, I think, on the first night or maybe the second or third night or something. But it seemed just like your typical sort of gang of gadflies that you often see in New York City at protest events, right? Initially. Yeah. But then it gradually gathered steam, but it took off when there were police quote unquote clashes or confrontations with famously this high-ranking NYPD officer named Anthony Bologna, not Bologna, but his name was spelled like Bologna, I think, coincidentally, spray painted a girl in her 20s, pepper sprayed,
yeah,
seemingly out of nowhere for no legitimate law enforcement purpose. And then, obviously that footage went everywhere, and then it kind of galvanized the movement. So there is definitely a sense in which having a confrontation with the state, the agents of the state, serves your interest if your interest is bringing about a wider insurrectionary movement.
Right. Yeah.
And and the George Floyd killing, I mean, is a paradigmatic example of that. Not that that was stemmed from an overt confrontation necessarily that was pre-planned.
Right.
But I think you need a very kind of vivid illustration of what happens when seemingly peaceful protesters confront the representatives of the state in order to ignite that. And so, yeah, it does make especially in the Pacific Northwest, like, I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. Like, look at what happened in Seattle. They just got the police chief to resign, who happens to be a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
Where, interestingly, they got the city council to prohibit the use of tear gas, which was then challenged in federal court. And I think the ruling was the legislative order was stayed. But still, I mean, it is engendering a lot of activity because and part of the reason why I give the anarchists in Portland credit is because by placing themselves under the banner of Black Lives Matter, given the moral standing that Black Lives Matter is perceived to have in the Democratic Party, in kind of interest groups associated with the Democratic Party, definitely in the media, then that enables them. They then kind of like, if they seize that banner for themselves, then that enables them to commit whatever kind of insurrectionary action they were ideologically disposed to carry out anyway. And so it's perfect strategically for them. So I see no reason why they wouldn't continue.
Yeah, but
it.
I mean, I can see one reason, which is that Biden gets elected in November.
Oh, yeah, possibly. I'm thinking more short term, like the summer.
Yeah, but their goal is to challenge.
And by the way, my light is getting dark now because I guess the sun's setting.
Yeah, I see that. We should probably end the conversation really soon. Yeah. But I just want to point out that their goal is to overthrow or overturn the capitalist system, theoretically, as anarchists. And if their goal is to do that, then this tactic isn't really paying off for them if the end result's going to be Biden gets elected and the conditions for their insurrection are going to go away. If they're really just a campaign asset, then this isn't paying off for them.
Possibly so. I mean, but they will have achieved mainstreaming anarchism to seemingly an unprecedented extent, regardless of the outcome of the election.
So they've moved the Overton window, you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, so there could be like insurrectionary conditions down the line, which this was a precursor to. Who knows? I don't know that they have. I don't know that they think about it in electoral terms quite like that. But it is. Well, but if you have random service workers in Eugene, Oregon, who are now like dipping their toes into insurrectionary anarchism, then that is in a sense a success of their strategic calculation.
Yeah, but I mean, look, 20-somethings have been dipping their toes into insurrectionary anarchism in the Pacific Northwest for a long time. At least I'm an example. Maybe I'm a real revolutionary, and by becoming like me, they will end up causing the overthrow of capitalism eventually. But I am more skeptical than you, I think, of this tactic working in the long haul. That I don't think that the approach. First of all, I think that the turn to anarchism is really more of a reflexive kind of act of desperation than it is a really fully thought out political move. Like these people, from what I hear, is like, they're going to meetings for the very first time and reading excerpts from the anarchist cookbook. This is not going to get them into any kind of deep understanding of the system, right? So, and I just feel as though what's going to happen is this will be funneled into the energy will be funneled into the Democratic Party, and it will be slowly turned off in 2021. And
maybe so. I mean, but I think the long haul is not really what is guiding them. I mean, they're taking it day to day. I mean, that's sort of the logic behind having a confrontation in Portland day after day after day, because there's always a chance that there's going to be some egregious police action carried out, which then could potentially spark a wider uprising, similar to what happened with George Floyd. So that's why I say that in terms of like, if you take their logic, leaving aside what it means for the quote long haul or for the election, that's what it seems. It makes logical sense for them to continue doing what they're doing because it's borne fruit.
What's the worst case scenario, Michael? If they are really successful, what do you think? Do you think they could bring the collapse of liberal America?
I kind of doubt it. I think that it would be a challenge for them to like take on the National Security Agency, for example, and the CIA, and I don't know, ExxonMobil and things. But they could try.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I feel like we've gotten to the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me on your channel, and let me know when you've got this video. Is anybody watching this right now, or are we just?
Yeah, we're streaming now. We have.
I don't see any of the comments. Are people?
You don't need to see them. People are saying that I've seen people contrasting this to the conversation with Vosh yesterday, and they find this conversation a lot more fruitful. So that's good. Although I tried to make lemonade out of lemons yesterday, and he actually conceded at the end that it was a constructive conversation.
Yeah.
We've had around 350, 400 people at any given time watching, and then obviously it'll go right onto YouTube so people can watch at their leisure. But I feel like most people commenting have liked the conversation, although I try not to pay too much attention to the comments as I'm trying to maintain focus on a discussion.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I stopped doing the live streams for my podcast because I would get so distracted by the comments that it would divert me from my task. But since I'm on your channel, everyone should buy my book. There it is, Bash Bash Revolution.
Yeah. I read recently a book published by ZeroBooks, A Left for Itself.
Yeah.
Which
David Swift.
Yeah, which I have some criticisms around the margins in terms of how the argument was constructed and various things, but I think there was something he was getting at there that was legitimate. And in any event, it was worth reading.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for that shout out. I should have, as a publishing manager, I shouldn't have pushed my own novel. I should have mentioned one of my authors.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
All right.
And then so I'll maybe send you a. So there are programs you can get that easily download YouTube videos, but I'll download this one and upload it to Dropbox or something.
That'd be great. I mean, I can download my own. Anyway, we can talk about this later.
This is the most fascinating part of the conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.